How one U.S. general helped win D-Day at Omaha Beach. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as thousands of young American soldiers were being cut down by German machine gun fire on a blood-soaked strip of French coastline, one 51-year-old general made a decision that would change the course of World War II. Standing on Omaha Beach with bullets snapping past his head, Brigadier General Norman Cota looked at the men cowering behind the seawall and shouted words that would echo through military history. Two kinds of people are staying on this beach: those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. This is the story of the man who refused to let the Allied invasion fail, and how his actions in those desperate hours helped save the world from Nazi tyranny. But to understand why Norman Cota's actions on D-Day were so crucial, we need to go back to the planning stages of Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The Allied commanders knew that breaching Hitler's Atlantic Wall would be the most dangerous military operation ever attempted. They had to land 156,000 troops on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast, all while under heavy fire from well-fortified German positions. The Germans had spent years preparing for this moment, building an elaborate network of bunkers, pillboxes, artillery positions, and obstacles designed to turn the beaches into killing zones. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had personally overseen improvements to the Atlantic Wall, declaring that the Allies must be stopped at the water's edge, or the war would be lost. Of the 5 landing beaches, Omaha was by far the most formidable. The beach was a crescent-shaped stretch of sand about 6 miles long, backed by steep bluffs that rose up to 150 feet high. The Germans had turned these bluffs into a fortress, with at least 8 bunkers containing 88mm guns, 35 pillboxes with artillery pieces and machine guns, 4 large artillery positions, 18 anti-tank guns, 6 mortar pits, and 35 rocket launcher sites. Between the waterline and the bluffs, the Germans had planted millions of mines and obstacles, including steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, and Belgian gates designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. The entire beach was pre-sighted, meaning German gunners had already calculated the exact range to every point where Americans might land. It was a death trap. The American plan for Omaha Beach called for an initial assault by 2 reinforced regiments, the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division and the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One. They would be supported by tanks, engineers, and naval gunfire. The planners expected heavy casualties, but believed that overwhelming firepower and careful coordination would allow the assault troops to quickly move off the beach and up the bluffs, opening the way for follow-on forces. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. Norman Daniel Cota was not your typical general. Born in 1893 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, he was the son of a French-Canadian immigrant father and had grown up in a working-class neighborhood. He attended Worcester Academy and then won an appointment to West Point, graduating in 1917 just as America entered World War I. Unlike many officers of his generation, Cota didn't see combat in the First World War, spending most of the conflict stateside as an instructor. This might have been seen as a disadvantage, but Cota used the time to become a student of warfare, particularly the problems of infantry tactics and leadership under fire. Between the wars, Cota attended the Command and General Staff School and the Army War College, marking him as a rising star in the officer corps. He served in various staff and command positions, developing a reputation as a thorough professional officer who cared deeply about the soldiers under his command. But what really set Cota apart was his belief in leading from the front. Many generals in World War II directed operations from headquarters miles behind the lines, studying maps and receiving reports. Cota believed that a commander's place was with his troops, especially when things went wrong. This philosophy would be put to the ultimate test on Omaha Beach. By 1942, Cota had been promoted to brigadier general and was assigned to help plan Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. His work there impressed his superiors. and in 1943 he was given command of the 29th Infantry Division's Assistant Division Commander position. The 29th was a National Guard division from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, a unit with a proud history dating back to the Civil War. These were citizen soldiers, not regular army, and Cota threw himself into training them for the massive invasion he knew was coming. He worked the men hard, conducting realistic amphibious assault exercises on the English coast. He personally led training missions, wading ashore with the troops, climbing cliffs, and crawling through obstacles. The soldiers of the 29th quickly learned that their general was not the type to sit in the rear. He was going to be right there with them when the shooting started. In the spring of 1944, as D-Day approached, the tension in England was palpable. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were packed into camps across southern England, waiting for the order to embark. The men knew they were part of something historic, but they also knew that many of them wouldn't survive. Cota spent these weeks visiting units, talking to soldiers, checking equipment, and making sure his commanders understood the plan. He had studied the intelligence reports on Omaha Beach and knew it would be the toughest of the 5 landing sites. The defenses were formidable, and unlike Utah Beach to the west, there were no exits that would allow vehicles to quickly move inland. Everything depended on the infantry getting off the beach and up those bluffs quickly. The night of June 5th, Cota boarded the USS Charles Carroll, the command ship for the assault on Omaha Beach. The original D-Day date of June 5th had been postponed for 24 hours due to terrible weather, and even now the conditions were marginal. The English Channel was rough, with waves running 6 feet high. As the massive armada of over 5,000 ships steamed toward France through the darkness, Cota tried to rest, knowing that the next day would require every ounce of his energy and courage. Around him, thousands of young soldiers tried to sleep in the cramped compartments below decks, the ships rolling and pitching in the heavy seas. Many were violently seasick, few slept. At 0200 hours on June 6th, the naval bombardment began. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire on the German positions along the Normandy coast. The sound was deafening, like continuous thunder, and the flashes of the big guns lit up the night sky. The plan called for a massive pre-invasion bombardment to destroy or suppress the German defenses, but there was a critical flaw. To avoid hitting their own troops, the naval gunners had been ordered to aim well inland, and the bombing runs by the 8th Air Force had also missed their targets, with most bombs falling miles behind the beach due to the cloud cover. The German fortifications at Omaha Beach would be virtually untouched when the first wave hit. At 0330 hours, the soldiers began loading into the landing craft. The sea was still rough, and climbing down the cargo nets into the small pitching boats was treacherous. Men carrying 60 to 80 pounds of equipment struggled to time their jump into the boat as it rose and fell in the waves. Some fell into the water and drowned, weighed down by their gear. The landing craft, called LCVTS or Higgins boats, were flat-bottomed vessels that could carry about 36 men. They were not designed for heavy seas, and as they began the long run to shore, many of the soldiers became desperately seasick, vomiting into their helmets or over the side. The boats took on water, and men used their helmets to bail frantically as the boat pitched and rolled. Cota was supposed to land with the 5th wave, which would hit the beach around H-hour plus 45 minutes, giving the initial assault waves time to clear the obstacles and establish a foothold. But as dawn broke and he watched from the deck of the Charles Carroll, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Through his binoculars, he could see that the beach was not secured. Landing craft were burning, bodies floated in the surf, and the soldiers who had made it to shore were pinned down, unable to advance. The radio reports coming in were fragmentary and confused, but the message was clear. The assault on Omaha Beach was failing. The first wave had hit the beach at 0630 hours, and within minutes, it had become a slaughter. The men of Companies A, E, F, and G of the 116th Infantry, along with elements of the 16th Infantry, waded through chest-deep water under a hurricane of fire. German machine gunners had perfect fields of fire, and they methodically swept the beach with interlocking bands of bullets. Artillery and mortar rounds exploded in the surf and on the sand. The water turned red with blood. Landing craft were hit before they could even lower their ramps, and when the ramps did drop, the men in front were cut down instantly. Some boats lost their entire complement before a single soldier reached the sand. Those who survived the dash to shore found themselves trapped. The plan had called for engineers to blow gaps in the obstacles and the seawall so that troops and vehicles could move inland. But most of the engineers had been killed or wounded in the first minutes, and their explosives had been lost. The few tanks that had made it to shore, specially designed amphibious Sherman tanks, quickly became targets and were knocked out. The soldiers huddled behind the obstacles and the low seawall that ran along part of the beach, but even there they weren't safe. German mortars dropped rounds among them, and machine gun fire ricocheted off the stones. Officers and NCOS who tried to organize their men were immediately targeted and shot. Companies that had landed as cohesive units were shattered, with men scattered up and down the beach, separated from their leaders and their equipment. By 0700 hours, Omaha Beach was a scene of absolute chaos and carnage. Bodies and parts of bodies littered the sand and floated in the bloody surf. Burning vehicles smoked on the beach. Wounded men cried out for medics, but the medics themselves were often casualties. The carefully planned invasion had degenerated into a desperate struggle for survival. On the bluffs above, German soldiers poured fire down onto the Americans. Some were so confident of victory that they stood up in the open to get better shots. One German soldier would later say that he felt sorry for the Americans. They had no chance. The senior American commander offshore, Major General Leonard Giroux, commander of V Corps, was receiving reports that painted a catastrophic picture. Entire units had ceased to exist as organized fighting forces. The 116th Infantry's Company A had landed in front of the heavily fortified Vierville Draw and been virtually annihilated in minutes. Of the 200 men who left the landing craft, only about 20 would survive the day unscathed, and most of those were wounded. Company C of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, tasked with scaling the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, had suffered 50% casualties. The reports from the battalion and regimental commanders, those who were still alive and could communicate, all said the same thing. They were pinned down, taking heavy casualties, and unable to advance. Some officers were recommending that the landing be called off and the follow-on waves diverted to Utah Beach. This was the situation Norman Cota found when he decided he couldn't wait any longer. It was around 0730 hours, and his landing craft was scheduled to go in soon regardless. But Cota knew that every minute of delay could mean the difference between a foothold and disaster. He gathered his small command group, including his aide, a radio man, and a few other officers, and climbed down into the landing craft. As the boat pulled away from the Charles Carroll and began its run to shore, Cota stood at the front, watching the beach grow closer. He could see the smoke, the explosions, the wreckage. He could hear the roar of gunfire even over the sound of the boat's engine. He knew that in a few minutes, he would be stepping into hell. The landing craft carrying Cota grounded about 100 yards from shore because the coxswain was afraid to go closer. The ramp dropped, and Cota and his group waded into water up to their waists. Immediately, machine gun bullets began striking the water around them, sending up little geysers. Artillery shells exploded nearby, throwing up columns of water and sand. Men were hit and fell into the surf. Cota kept moving forward, urging his group on. One of his aides would later say that the general seemed completely calm, as if he were on a training exercise. They reached the shallows and ran the last few yards to the relative safety of the shingle bank, a steep embankment of stones and pebbles that provided some cover. What Cota found on the beach was worse than anything he had imagined. Men were packed together behind the seawall and the shingle bank, lying as flat as possible to avoid the fire that swept over them. Many were in shock, staring blankly. Some were wounded but unable to move. Officers tried to get their men organized, but with communications disrupted and units mixed together, it was nearly impossible. Equipment was scattered everywhere. Bangalore torpedoes, needed to blow gaps in the wire, lay unused because the men who knew how to set them were dead. Kota quickly assessed the situation and realized that if something didn't change in the next few minutes, the invasion would fail. Thousands of men would die on this beach, and without Omaha, the entire D-Day operation would be in jeopardy. The problem was simple, but seemingly insurmountable. The men had to get off the beach and up the bluffs, but to do so, they had to cross 200 yards of open ground that was zeroed in by German guns. Anyone who stood up was immediately shot at. Any attempt to organize a rush was met with devastating fire. The soldiers had been trained to follow orders and stick together, but their officers were dead or wounded, and the units were hopelessly mixed up. What was needed was someone to take charge, to show them that it was possible to move, to lead by example. Norman Kota decided he would be that someone. Kota began moving along the beach, ignoring the bullets that snapped past him. He stopped at groups of soldiers and talked to them, asking what unit they were from, where their officers were, what their mission was. He spoke calmly, as if they were having a conversation in a safe place rather than in the middle of a battle. His presence had an immediate effect. Here was a general, easily identified by the white stars on his helmet, walking around as if he owned the beach. If he could do it, maybe they could too. Kota started giving orders, not just to officers, but to individual soldiers. He told them where to go, what to do. He organized small groups to retrieve equipment, to treat wounded, to set up defensive positions. But Kota knew that simply organizing the men on the beach wasn't enough. They had to attack. The only way to silence the German guns was to get to them, and that meant going up the bluffs. He looked for a place to start, and he found it near a destroyed house at the edge of the beach where there was a gap in the wire. He gathered a group of soldiers, maybe 20 or 30 men from different units, including some from the 5th Ranger Battalion. The Rangers were elite troops, specially trained for difficult missions, and Kota had great confidence in them. But even these tough soldiers were shaken by the carnage around them. Kota looked at the men and made his famous speech. The exact words vary depending on who you ask, but the essence was the same. He told them that they couldn't stay on the beach. Staying meant dying. The only way to survive was to move forward, to attack, to get up those bluffs and kill the Germans who were killing them. Some accounts say he asked them, "What outfit is this?" When they answered 5th Rangers, he said, "Well, goddammit, Rangers lead the way." Other accounts have slightly different versions, but what's clear is that Kota inspired these men to do something they thought was impossible. He was going to lead them off the beach, and he expected them to follow. Kota didn't just give a speech and then send the men forward while he stayed behind. That wasn't his style. He personally led the way, moving toward the gap in the wire with bullets kicking up dirt around him. He found a Bangalore torpedo, a long tube packed with explosives used to blow up obstacles, and organized some engineers to set it. The explosion tore a gap in the wire, and Kota was the first one through. He started up the bluff, using the terrain for cover, moving from crater to shell hole. The men followed him, inspired by his courage. German machine gunners spotted the movement and opened fire, but Kota kept going. The climb up the bluff was a nightmare. The slope was steep and covered with tall grass that concealed mines. Every few yards there was wire to cut through or obstacles to avoid. German soldiers in trenches at the top fired down on the Americans. Hand grenades rolled down the slope. Men were hit and tumbled back down the hill. But Kota kept pushing, and the men kept following. They crawled, they ran short distances between cover, they helped each other over obstacles. Slowly, painfully, they made progress. Other soldiers on the beach saw what was happening and began to follow. First a few, then more, then dozens. The paralysis that had gripped the beach was starting to break. It took about 30 minutes for Kota and his group to reach the top of the bluff. When they got there, they found themselves in a different kind of fight. The German positions were elaborate networks of trenches, bunkers, and communication trenches. Fighting was close and brutal. Americans and Germans sometimes fought hand-to-hand. Grenades were thrown into bunkers. Machine gun nests were flanked and destroyed. Kota moved from position to position, directing the fight, organizing the men as more and more soldiers made it up from the beach. He was everywhere. seemingly immune to danger, his presence inspiring the men to feats of courage they didn't know they had in them. Around the same time, similar scenes were playing out at other points along Omaha Beach. Colonel George Taylor, commander of the 16th Infantry Regiment, rallied his men with his own famous words. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry, despite being wounded, led his men off the beach shouting orders and profanity in equal measure. These leaders, and dozens of junior officers and NCOs whose names we don't know, made the same decision Coda made. They couldn't wait for the plan to work. They had to improvise, to lead, to attack. And slowly, their courage began to turn the tide. By 0900 hours, small groups of Americans had established positions on top of the bluffs at several points. They weren't organized units following a coordinated plan. They were ad hoc teams of soldiers from different companies, different battalions, even different divisions, led by whoever was willing to lead. Coda moved between these groups, coordinating their actions, sending some to attack German positions, while others provided covering fire. He organized the clearing of the draws, the ravines that led from the beach up to the bluffs, which were heavily defended but necessary to get vehicles off the beach. The fighting was still intense. German counterattacks tried to push the Americans back to the beach, but each attack was beaten off. More American troops were landing now, and while they still faced fire coming ashore, the situation was slowly improving. Navy destroyers had moved in close to the beach, so close they risked running aground, and were firing directly at German positions that the soldiers on the ground identified for them. This close fire support was crucial in suppressing the German guns. Coda spent the entire day moving around the battlefield, always where the fighting was hottest. He was nearly hit multiple times. At one point, a bullet passed through his radio operator's pack. Another time, he was knocked down by a near miss from an artillery shell, but he got up and kept going. His aide tried to get him to take cover or move to a safer position, but Coda refused. He knew that his presence made a difference, that the men fought harder when they could see that their general was right there with them, sharing the danger. By noon, the situation had improved enough that follow-on waves were landing with acceptable casualties. By early afternoon, engineers had cleared some of the draws and vehicles were beginning to move inland. The crisis had passed. Omaha Beach was secure, though at a terrible cost. The exact casualty figures for D-Day at Omaha are difficult to determine because records were incomplete and many units were so disrupted that accurate counts were impossible. But estimates suggest that the Americans suffered between 2,000 and 3,000 casualties on Omaha Beach on June 6th, with several hundred killed. Some units lost more than 75% of their men. It was by far the bloodiest of the 5 D-Day beaches, but they had succeeded. They had cracked Hitler's Atlantic Wall. And while many factors contributed to that success, including the heroism of thousands of individual soldiers, the Navy's fire support, and the eventual degradation of German defenses, the role of leaders like Norman Coda cannot be overstated. At the moment when the invasion teetered on the edge of disaster, Coda's leadership made the difference. His decision to land early, his courage under fire, his ability to organize and inspire men in the chaos of battle, helped turn a potential catastrophe into a victory. In the days and weeks after D-Day, Coda continued to lead from the front. The 29th Infantry Division fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, brutal close-quarters fighting that was as dangerous as anything on Omaha Beach. Coda was always with his troops, earning their deep respect and loyalty. On June 11th, just 5 days after D-Day, the division commander was killed, and Coda was given temporary command of the entire 29th Division, making him one of the youngest major generals in the European theater. Coda led the 29th Division through the breakout from Normandy and across France. In August 1944, he was given command of the 28th Infantry Division, another storied National Guard unit. He led the 28th through the liberation of Paris, and in September, participated in the ill-fated Operation Market Garden. But Koda's finest hour remained those desperate morning hours on Omaha Beach, when he refused to let the invasion fail. In December 1944, Koda and the 28th Division found themselves in the Ardennes forest when the Germans launched their surprise offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The 28th was hit hard and took heavy casualties, including many men captured when they were surrounded. Some historians have criticized Koda's dispositions during the Bulge, arguing that his division was too spread out. But the 28th Division's stubborn resistance, though costly, helped delay the German advance and contributed to the eventual Allied victory. Koda continued to serve after the Bulge, leading his division through the final campaigns in Germany until the surrender in May 1945. After the war, he served in various positions before retiring from the Army in 1946. He had earned the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, for his actions on D-Day. The citation read in part, "His personal courage and gallant leadership were instrumental in reorganizing and inspiring the disorganized assault troops to continue their attack against the enemy." In retirement, Koda settled in Philadelphia and worked for a time in the private sector. He rarely spoke publicly about D-Day, never seeking recognition or glory for what he had done. To him, he had simply done his duty, what any officer should do. When asked about Omaha Beach, he would typically deflect the praise to the soldiers who had done the fighting, the young men who had crossed that terrible beach and climbed those bluffs despite being scared to death. In Koda's view, they were the real heroes, not him. Norman Koda died in 1971 at the age of 78. His funeral was a military affair with full honors, but it was relatively small. He was buried at West Point, overlooking the Hudson River, where his military career had begun more than 50 years earlier. In the decades since his death, Koda's reputation has grown. Military historians studying D-Day have increasingly recognized the crucial role he and a handful of other leaders played in saving the invasion. Without men like Koda willing to risk everything, willing to lead by example in the most desperate circumstances, Omaha Beach would have been lost. Today, when you visit Omaha Beach, you can stand on the sand and look up at those bluffs. It's peaceful now, with waves gently lapping the shore and seabirds calling overhead. There's a monument to the American soldiers who fought here, and nearby is the American Cemetery, where rows of white crosses mark the graves of nearly 10,000 American servicemen. It's hard to imagine, standing there in the quiet, what that beach was like on June 6, 1944. The terror, the chaos, the deafening noise, the blood and bodies in the surf. But if you close your eyes, you can almost see a 51-year-old general in a wet uniform, water dripping from his helmet, striding across that beach with bullets snapping past him. You can almost hear him shouting to terrified young soldiers, telling them they have to move, they have to fight, they have to follow him up that bluff. You can almost feel the moment when those men, despite their fear, despite having watched their friends die around them, decided to follow that general, to do the impossible, to attack into the teeth of the German defenses. The story of D-Day is often told as a story of massive forces, of thousands of ships and planes and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It's presented as inevitable, the vast power of the Allies overwhelming the German defenses through sheer weight of numbers and material. But that's not how it felt on Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6th. On that beach, at that moment, nothing was inevitable. Victory hung by the slenderest thread, and that thread was the courage of individual men. Men like Norman Koda who, when everything was falling apart and the outcome was in doubt, stepped forward and led. There's a leadership principle that Koda embodied perfectly, though he probably never articulated it in these terms. It's the idea that a leader's most important role is not to make plans or give orders from a safe distance. Those things are important, but they're not what separates great leaders from mediocre ones. What makes a great leader is the willingness to share the danger with their troops, to be present at the critical moment, to show by personal example that the mission can be accomplished. Soldiers will follow an officer who they know will never ask them to do something he wouldn't do himself. They'll follow a leader who they've seen stay calm under fire, who they know won't abandon them when things get tough. Kota understood this instinctively. He had spent his career studying warfare and leadership, but his philosophy came down to something simple and profound. A leader's place is with his troops, especially when they're in danger. That's why he landed on Omaha Beach when he could have stayed offshore. That's why he walked around under fire organizing the defense. That's why he personally led the first group up the bluff. Not because he had to, not because his orders required it, but because he knew his presence would make a difference. And he was right. The impact of Kota's actions rippled far beyond Omaha Beach. The success of D-Day, bought at such terrible cost, was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Within 11 months, the war in Europe would be over, Hitler would be dead, and the concentration camps would be liberated. The world that emerged from World War II, for all its flaws and problems, was infinitely better than the one that would have existed if Hitler had won. And Hitler's defeat began on the beaches of Normandy, particularly at Omaha, where the invasion came closest to failure. It's worth considering what might have happened if Omaha Beach had been lost. The consequences would have been catastrophic. The Germans would have thrown the Allies back into the sea, inflicting massive casualties and destroying dozens of ships and hundreds of landing craft. The blow to Allied morale would have been severe. The invasion would have to be postponed for months, perhaps a year, while new forces were assembled and new plans made. In that time, the Germans could have strengthened their defenses even more. The V-2 rockets that were just beginning to hit London could have been produced in greater numbers. German jet fighters, which were technologically superior to anything the Allies had, could have been deployed in larger numbers. Most ominously, the Germans could have continued their nuclear weapons research program. While it's unlikely they would have developed an atomic bomb, even a few more months could have made a difference. But that's not what happened. And a significant part of why it didn't happen was because Norman Kota made the choice to be a leader when leadership was most needed. He chose to step into danger when he could have stayed safe. He chose to take responsibility when others might have waited for orders. He chose to inspire men by example rather than by words alone. These choices, made in the space of a few hours on a blood-soaked beach in France, helped change the course of history. When we think about heroes, we often imagine people who are somehow different from the rest of us, people with special qualities that set them apart. But Norman Kota wasn't superhuman. He was scared on Omaha Beach just like everyone else. He had spent years preparing for that day, true, but nothing could really prepare someone for the reality of what he encountered when he waded ashore. What made him a hero wasn't that he lacked fear, it was that he acted despite his fear. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it, regardless of the risk to himself. This is perhaps the most important lesson from Norman Kota's story. Heroes aren't born, they're made in the moment of crisis. They're ordinary people who, when confronted with extraordinary circumstances, make the choice to act rather than freeze, to lead rather than follow, to sacrifice rather than survive. Every one of those soldiers on Omaha Beach faced the same choice. Some made it and became heroes, even if their names were never recorded. Many paid for that choice with their lives, but collectively, their courage saved the invasion, and with it, the world. In the years since D-Day, Omaha Beach has become a symbol of American sacrifice and determination. Presidents have given speeches there. Movies have depicted the landings in graphic detail. Thousands of tourists visit each year to pay their respects. The story of Omaha has been told and retold, becoming part of the national mythology. But sometimes in the retelling, the human dimension gets lost. We see the masses of troops, the vast armada, the grand strategy, and we forget that it all came down to individual decisions made by individual men in moments of extreme peril. Norman Kota's story reminds us of that human dimension. It brings us back to the reality of what it meant to fight on that beach. Every one of those soldiers had a life before the war, had people who loved them, had dreams and hopes for the future. Most were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and factory workers, students and shopkeepers who had been called to service. They didn't want to be on that beach facing death. They wanted to be home with their families, but they were there, and when the moment came, they did what had to be done. The phrase, "the greatest generation," is sometimes criticized as overly sentimental or as diminishing the sacrifices of other generations. But when you look at what the men of D-Day accomplished, it's hard to argue with the sentiment. They faced something truly terrible, and they didn't run. They didn't surrender. They fought and died to defeat genuine evil. And they did it not for glory or conquest, but for the simple belief that freedom and human dignity were worth fighting for. Norman Cota embodied the best qualities of that generation. He was competent and professional, having spent years mastering his craft. He was courageous, willing to risk his life for his mission and his men. He was humble, never seeking glory for himself but always deflecting credit to others. And he was deeply committed to the cause, understanding that the war against Nazi Germany was not just another conflict, but a struggle for civilization itself. After the war, Cota could have leveraged his fame into a political career or sought lucrative business opportunities. Some World War II heroes did exactly that, and no one would have blamed them. But Cota preferred a quiet retirement, working a regular job, living a normal life. He didn't write a memoir or give lectures about his experiences. He didn't need the recognition. He had done his duty, and that was enough. This humility is instructive. In our modern age of social media and constant self-promotion, where everyone seeks recognition for even minor achievements, Cota's reticence seems almost incomprehensible. Here was a man who had genuinely changed history, who had helped win the greatest war in human history, and he didn't feel the need to talk about it. He understood that what he had done was important not because it made him special, but because it served a cause larger than himself. The men who fought on D-Day are nearly all gone now. As of 2026, the youngest veterans of World War II are over 95 years old, and each year fewer remain. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it was like to storm those beaches, to face that fire, to climb those bluffs. The first-hand memory of D-Day will fade into history, known only through recordings and documents. This makes it all the more important that we remember their stories, that we understand what they did and why they did it. Norman Cota's story is worth remembering not just because of what he accomplished on June 6, 1944, but because of what his example teaches us about leadership, courage, and duty. In our own lives, we face moments of crisis, times when we must choose between the safe path and the right path. We may never face anything as dramatic as storming a fortified beach under fire, but the principle is the same. Do we act or do we hesitate? Do we lead or do we wait for someone else? Do we accept responsibility or do we make excuses? Cota shows us that true leadership means being willing to go first, to face danger before asking others to face it, to take responsibility for outcomes rather than blame circumstances. It means seeing what needs to be done and doing it, regardless of whether it's in your job description or whether you'll get credit. It means caring more about the mission and the people depending on you than about your own safety or advancement. These are timeless principles that apply far beyond the battlefield. They apply in business when a company faces crisis and needs someone to step up. They apply in communities when disaster strikes and people need help. They apply in families when difficult decisions